Hello and welcome. The topic of this lecture is theories of well-being. We're taking a bit of a vacation from theories of morality, which will be mostly the concern of this course. But theories of well-being are adjacent to theories of morality, and some theories of well-being are even components of some theories of morality, so it'll pay to be familiar with at least some of these. So the topic of a theory of well-being is the concept of well-being. So we should explain that first. Well-being is sometimes written as welfare. It means the same thing. It's what makes a life a good one for the one who's living it, right? And the nature of well-being, or the good life, as it's also sometimes called, has been the primary concern of philosophers since at least Socrates. Of course, people were thinking about the good life before then, but it was a preoccupation with the good life is one of the things that really distinguishes Socrates' approach to philosophy. He liked to sort of connect all philosophical problems in some sense to the notion of the good life, the best life for a person. And of course, it's a tremendously valuable question. I don't think I have to tell you why it should be important for us all to think about what the best life we could live is. In the well over 2,000 years of philosophy, certainly in the Western tradition, it would be surprising if we hadn't made at least some progress on a question so important, and of course we have. There's been a great many potential answers. Lots of people have said lots of things about what the good life consists in, what is well-being, what is welfare, what makes a life go well for the person who lives it. But we have essentially narrowed down three families of views, right? When I say families of views, what I mean is that not all hedonistic views are the same. There are lots of little sub-varieties, but we're not going to be very concerned with all those sub-varieties. We're also not going to be so concerned with all the sub-varieties of desire satisfaction theories. There are many, and of course there are many, many different kinds of objectivist views also. And so that's why I call these families of views, but in general, you can wait until a much more advanced ethics course to really get into a lot of the sub-varieties of each of these views. Just understanding the basic outline, which each of these tend to have in common, will do us just fine. So let's start with hedonism. Hedonism is the view that the best life is the one with the most pleasure in it. So if you're reading the Russ Schaefer-Landau text that comes along with this course, you'll notice that Schaefer-Landau sometimes uses the word happiness to mean well-being or welfare, and sometimes he uses happiness to mean pleasure. It's ever so slightly annoying, but just be aware that that's the case, and that'll really help you keep track. It is fairly clear from context when he means happiness when he uses happiness to mean pleasure, and when he uses the word happiness to mean well-being, right? But for the hedonist, all of those things all come to the same thing. Happiness, pleasure, well-being, it's all just the same thing. It's all essentially pleasure. And that's it's a very ancient view, and I should point out just a couple of things about it here. The first of those, and in that first bullet point there, says that the modern usage of the term hedonist doesn't reflect the views of most actual hedonists. Now, if you have heard the term hedonist before, it probably has a certain connotation for you. You think of people who are, sort of party animals and, pleasure seekers and that sort of thing. If you've never heard the term hedonist before, well, no problem. But if you were to Google it, if you were to Google the word hedonist or hedonism, you might get some snippets of stuff about the actual philosophy. Again, partially that depends what your search history is like. But you'll also see advertisements for nightclubs and nude beaches and various things like that. And so again, there's a sense in which sometimes people use the word hedonist in casual conversation to mean some sort of like pleasure-seeking, party animal, somebody who's very committed to various kinds of sensual pleasures. That's not really what ancient and even modern hedonism in the philosophical sense is all about. And Schaefer-Landau draws a distinction in the textbook between what he calls attitudinal pleasures and physical pleasures. So this is the difference between watching your favorite niece ride her bicycle for the first time, right? That's a kind of attitudinal pleasure. It doesn't actually physically feel good to watch that, but it's a pleasant experience, right? That's an attitudinal pleasure. Whereas a physical pleasure might be something like, eating a really good ice cream on a hot day, right? I mean, that's a physical pleasure thing. It tastes good or it feels nice, right? That's a very sort of physical thing. And although Schaefer-Landau really does draw a hard distinction between these two things, most hedonists historically do not. They sort of throw an umbrella over the whole concept and say, pleasure's pleasure, right? All of those things are pleasures. The attitudinal pleasures are pleasures. The physical pleasures are pleasures. The best life is the one with the most of that stuff in it, however you mix it up. Some famous hedonists include these folks here. In the text, Schaefer-Landau also lists John Stuart Mill. I think Mill's utilitarianism is much more, or rather, the hedonism that John Stuart Mill expresses, I think, is much more clearly expressed by his mentor and godfather, actually, Jeremy Bentham, who's here pictured. That's an actual color photograph of Jeremy Bentham, even though he died in 1832. We'll actually talk a little bit more about that interesting factoid in the next unit. And on the left, you see sort of a photograph of a statue of what Epicurus probably looked nothing like. I very much doubt that original was carved by anybody who actually knew the man. But in any case, that's Epicurus is a famous hedonist from the ancient world. And in fact, if you put Epicurean into a Google search, or if you've heard the term before, you'll notice it has a kind of association with sort of the finer things in life, especially food. So there's an Epicurious cooking webpage. There's an Epicurean line of kitchenware. I will say I have some of their cutting boards, and they're very good. But in any case, that's drifted a long way from Epicurus's original viewpoint. Epicurus had this view, and you can read his famous letter to Menoetius. It's public domain by now. You could find it anywhere. If you just put in Epicurus letter, you'll get that in the search field. And it's basically somebody has said, hey, how do I live my best life? And Epicurus basically tells this person named Menoetius how to live their best life. And his advice is very much live a simple life, right? Because a simple life is one in which there's not a lot of pain, right? He doesn't say go gung-ho for all of the greatest pleasures you can find. Rather, he says, if you live a very reserved life, right? If you get yourself used to not needing a whole lot, then when you do have these really good things, these luxuries, right? The really fine foods here and there, you'll enjoy them all the much more, right? So it's a very interesting and in some ways counterintuitive picture of how to pack your life full of the best pleasures. But it's a very interesting view, and what characterizes it is this idea that, again, the best life is the one with the most pleasure in it. That's a characteristically hedonist view. So here we'll see our first objection to hedonism. Hedonism will generate some objections. It does have some problems. It's a very plausible overall view. A lot of what it says makes sense. But it does have at least some difficulties. And you'll see that many of the ideas that we'll talk about in this course are ideas that are pretty good, but that do have some problems. Our major moral theories, there are a small number of those. Each of them really do make a lot of sense, but none of them are perfect. They do generate some objections. And the people who hold those moral theories will generally have some reasonable reply to them. The same is the case for theories of well-being. There are three major families of theories of well-being. Each of them does make a lot of sense, but none of them are perfect. They do generate some objections, and of course the people who hold those views have some reasonable replies generally to those objections. If we had some view that made a lot of sense and that nobody could think of any problems with, well, we'd pretty much then say, hey, we think this is the right view. It's the view that makes a lot of sense that nobody has any problem with. But we don't quite have that. And so what we've done is we've used this process of objecting to these various ideas to sort of narrow the field, right? Some of these objections are bad enough that maybe we might think of discarding the view. In the other cases, some of these objections there might be reasonable replies to them. So this is one of those objections that hedonists have a pretty reasonable reply to. We can call this the objection from evil pleasures. And it goes something like this. I've taken the argument from page 34 of Schaefer-Landau's Fundamentals of Ethics. It says in its first premise, if hedonism is true, then happiness that comes from evil deeds is as good as happiness that comes from kind and decent actions. The second premise says happiness that comes from evil deeds is not as good as happiness that comes from kind and decent actions. Therefore, hedonism is not true. It appears to be a valid argument. It looks like it has the structure of modus tollens, which is a nice valid argument form. But there is a trouble with the argument. The trouble seems to be that the argument equivocates, right? This is a special problem that happens with some arguments. Equivocation is what happens when a word or phrase is used in a different way in each premise of an argument. And so arguments that equivocate end up looking like they ought to be valid, but turn out not to be valid because they're using the same word or phrase just differently, right? It looks like it's the same word, it isn't. So a quick example is the argument, aspirin is a drug, drugs are illegal, therefore aspirin is illegal. Okay, we know that since the conclusion is false, something's got to be a little funny somewhere, and it turns out that even though the argument looks like it ought to be valid, the trouble is that it uses the word drug in two different ways once in each premise. So in the first premise that says that aspirin is a drug, the word drug in that context means medicine, and it's true, aspirin is a medicine. In the second premise, when it says drugs are illegal, the word drug means some controlled substance like cocaine or something like that. And in that sense, premise 2 is true, right? That illegal controlled substances are illegal, right? And it's just that the word drug in the first premise and the word drug in the second premise are not used in the same way. So the argument sort of looks initially like it's valid, but it isn't really. So some of these are even humorous. One of my favorites comes from Bertrand Russell. His favorite example of equivocation was the disciples were 12, Matthew was a disciple, therefore Matthew was 12. Right? If you can find the equivocation in there, then pat yourself on the back. In any case, the argument in front of us, this argument from evil pleasures, equivocates in the following way. Notice that in premise 1, where it says pleasure from evil deeds is as good as, right, pleasure from kind and decent actions, what it means is as good for the person who experiences it as pleasure from kind and decent actions, right? And that is in fact what a hedonist will tell you. A hedonist will tell you that pleasure is pleasure no matter how you get it, and the life that has more of it is the better life, and that's the view. That's hedonism. It's very simple. In premise 2, though, where it says that pleasure from evil deeds is not as good as pleasure from kind and decent actions, it doesn't mean the same thing as good as in the first premise does. In the first premise, we mean as good for the person who experiences it as, right? Whereas in premise 2, when we say that pleasure from evil deeds is not as good as pleasure from kind and decent actions, we tend to mean it's not as morally good as pleasure from kind and decent actions. And that's two different interpretations of the phrase as good as, one of them in the first premise and the other in the second premise. If you use the sense that it's meant in the first premise in the second premise also, so that we're using the same term again, well, then all of a sudden premise 2 looks like the sort of thing that a hedonist would reject. In fact, hedonists will tell you, look, happiness that comes from evil deeds is every bit as good for the person who experiences it as happiness that comes from kind and decent actions. Right? That just is the view. They don't really get particular about where the pleasure comes from or about how one gets it. They just say that a life with more pleasure in it is a better one. And so this is one of the things that you really should keep in mind throughout the course, that hedonism is a theory of well-being. It's a theory of when a life goes better. It's not a theory of what to do. Right? It may be that your life would go better for you if you had more pleasure in it, and that you could put more pleasure into your life by doing all kinds of evil things. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should do those evil things, right? A moral theory will not always tell you to do something that is good for you or that helps you live a good life. Well, depending on the moral theory. A second objection to hedonism is a very, very old one, and it's the accusation that hedonism is, quote, a philosophy of swine, right? The idea is that if pleasure is all that makes a life good and pain is all that makes a life bad, then it seems like the best possible life anyone could lead is a life, quote unquote, like a pig in slop or something like that, right? And it seems like we want more out of life than just pleasures, right? And so it seems like hedonism maybe doesn't get everything that we think of as an ingredient to the good life. So this is a quotation from a fellow named Roger Crisp, who wrote an article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The Stanford Encyclopedia is an online encyclopedia. It's totally free. Its URL is plato.stanford.edu. And its entries are written by professional philosophers, mostly for professional philosophers, just to help save us a lot of time, track down various kinds of references, sort of outline complex and thorny topics, and get ideas of where to examine these things further, so that we're not reinventing the wheel all the time. But there's a really excellent article. It's linked in your recommended readings area of the readings for this week, and it's describes some of these things here. So here's what Crisp says about hedonism and the philosophy of swine objection. He puts it this way: simple hedonism places all pleasures on a par, whether they be the lowest animal pleasures of sex or the highest of aesthetic appreciation. Imagine that you are given the choice of living a very fulfilling human life or that of a barely sentient oyster, which experiences some very low-level pleasure. Imagine also that the life of the oyster can be made as long as you like, whereas the human life will be of 80 years only. If Bentham were right, there would have to be a length of oyster life such that you would choose it in preference to the human, and yet many would say that they would choose the human life in preference to an oyster life of any length. So let's talk about this particular objection in a little more detail. Let's use an example here. So on the left, there's a picture of some oysters prepared for dining here. And in fact, I got this image from epicurious.com. It's from a recipe. And I got it from Epicurious for obvious reasons. So basically, think of an oyster at 0.5 hedons of pleasure a year. We don't actually have a unit for pleasure, but if we did, it would probably be called hedons, right? So I'm sort of making this up. So the idea is that if an oyster, again, experiences a very low level pleasure, just half of a hedon every year, right? Well, then if it lived for 1,382 years, then that would be a total of 691 hedons of pleasure. So if you wanted to sort of quantify the amount of pleasure that's in that life, it's 691. Okay. Whereas you might compare a human life, perhaps even a very good human life. Here is photographed the public health professor Hans Rosling, who lived from 1948 until 2017. I never met him personally, but from my interactions with some of his videos and books, I think he probably enjoyed his life very much. He was one of my favorite humans, so I've gone ahead and just used him as an example here. So if you do the math, he lived for 69 years. And so if we assume, just for the sake of the experiment, that he had a life of, roughly 10 hedons per year of pleasure, then over 69 years, that's 690 hedons of total pleasure. Now notice, his pleasures are much more intense, right? He's living 10 hedons. That's 20 times the pleasure per year that the oyster experiences. It's just the oyster experiences it for much longer. And it seems like, I think you can see how the math works here, that if we just can keep extending the oyster life, then it's something like, no matter how good the human life is, if the oyster life were only just a little longer, it would seem to be preferable, if we're just choosing the life with the most pleasure in it. Okay, that's how the objection works. It says, if hedonism says that the best life is the one with the most pleasure in it, a really, really long oyster life, if we just keep making it longer and longer, would have the most pleasure in it compared to basically anything. And so that means the oyster life must be then the best life, or at least a life preferable to that of a human life in this case. But I ask you, would you rather be Hans Rosling or an oyster? And I think most people say, well, I think I'd rather be Hans Rosling, thanks. I'd rather live a human life than an oyster life, no matter how long it is. And so maybe that indicates that there is something other than pleasure as a component of the good life. Maybe the good life contains more than just pleasure. Another sort of historically famous reply to the philosophy of swine comes from this fellow here that Schaeffer-Landau does mention in the text. This is John Stuart Mill. As I mentioned, he's the godson of Jeremy Bentham. And his reply is as follows, right? He seems to think that the quantity of pleasure is not the most important thing. He thinks that some pleasures are of higher quality than others. So sometimes people call this qualitative hedonism instead of quantitative hedonism. And this is what Mill himself wrote in a book he wrote called Utilitarianism. He said, "Few human creatures would agree to be changed into any of the lower animals in return for a promise of the fullest allowance of human pleasures. No intelligent human being would consent to be a fool. No educated person would prefer to be an ignoramus. No person of feeling and conscience would rather be selfish and base, even if they were convinced that the fool, the dunce, or the rascal is better satisfied with his life than they are with theirs." For the sake of giving credit where credit is due, the editing on that paragraph is from early modern texts. You can find them on the web, where they do a lot of really nice sort of modern language edits of a lot of classic philosophy from the modern period. And so we see here that Mill is proposing, as Schaeffer-Landau describes in the text, a kind of hedonism where there are certain higher qualities of pleasure, not just quantity. So it's not just about how many hedons; it's about what kind of pleasure it is, and it's an interesting view, and it's certainly one way that many hedonists have gone. Perhaps the most famous objection to hedonism, it's certainly the one that everybody likes to talk about. It's Robert Nozick's Human Experience Machine. There you see Robert Nozick photographed. He was a prominent American philosopher, lived from 1938 to 2002, worked at Harvard for most of his career, right across the hall from another very famous philosopher named John Rawls, who you'd read a lot about if you read about justice. But Nozick's thought experiment goes this way. He says, imagine that I have a machine that I could plug you into for the rest of your life. This machine would give you experiences of whatever kind you thought most valuable or enjoyable. Writing a great novel, bringing about world peace, attending an early Rolling Stones gig. You would not know you were on the machine, and there is no worry about its breaking down or whatever. Would you plug in? Would it be wise, from the point of view of your own well-being, to do so? And of course, Nozick thinks that it would be a mistake to plug in, as do many who read this thought experiment. As Nozick puts it, he says, we want to do certain things, we want to be a certain way. Plugging into an experience machine limits us to a man-made reality. Right. So let's get clear about what the thought experiment says and what it doesn't say before we start discussing it a little bit further. The point of the thought experiment is to say, look, if pleasant experiences are all that there is to the good life, then generating those pleasant experiences by, say, a machine would be just as good as generating them in any other way. And it does seem like the hedonist would be forced to accept that. After all, remember their reply to the evil pleasures argument, right? They say, look, it doesn't really matter. A pleasure is a pleasure is a pleasure. The more of it in a life, the better the life. And so if they're gonna take the same line, let's take that line there. It seems like they have to take that line here as well, and say, yeah, I guess, fine. Go ahead and plug in. The experience machine. If it creates good experiences, well, then yeah, you'd lead a good life by plugging in. And a lot of people find that to be a little bit counterintuitive. However, I don't think this is as good an objection as many want it to be, and there are some replies. So one of those replies is that just as a matter of fact, you can't actually know that you are not in the experience machine right now. But it doesn't really seem to affect your choosing pleasurable over painful experiences. Right, like whatever you're doing right now, you're generally choosing sort of pleasant things. When you go to a restaurant and see two dishes, one of which you enjoy eating and one of which you don't, you're going to order the one that you do enjoy, unless you find some compelling reason why you would, in the end, get more pleasure from the one you don't enjoy. Like maybe it's healthier, I don't know. But the idea is you're in general choosing good experiences over bad ones. But really, do you know that you're not some sort of a brain in a jar somewhere? No, I don't see how you could. Do you know that you're not plugged into the machine? I mean, that's part of the thought experiment, is that you'd never know. And so you might not know right now. And if that doesn't bother you, then plugging in a machine shouldn't bother you. And so certainly there's that. I think there are other stronger replies to the experience machine argument. One of those is that Nozick seems to assume incorrectly that computers can only simulate experience. And this is one of these things where especially if you're dealing with a lot of really older machines, that it's an easy mental leap to get into. Yes, computers do simulate lots of things, right? You can watch a computer simulate a hurricane. You can have a program that simulates building a city. You're not actually building a city, you're only simulating it, etc. Like there's lots of things you do. A lot of games are sort of simulating experience, right? Or simulating a particular kind of point of view or something like that. So yes, computers do simulate things, but that's not all they do. If you ever watch, for example, an automotive factory, you see all these robot arms moving parts and bolting them together and doing welds and formings, essentially building cars. And there aren't like engineers with joysticks controlling all those robot arms just out of the scenes. They're all computer controlled. And so it's not that the computer is simulating building a car. The computer is actually building a car. Like somebody's going to get into it and drive it. And so just because computers do simulate things, that doesn't mean that that's all that they do. So a computer could simulate giving somebody an experience, but it could also actually give somebody an experience. So basically the reply is that the source of the experience does not actually affect the reality of the experience, right? Somebody who is in the experience machine really is having the experiences that they believe they're having. They feel a certain way, they see a certain thing, so in other words, virtual reality is still reality. Okay, this is one of the things that kind of drives me a little bit crazy, is people say, oh, well, virtual, it's all fake. It's like, well, I mean, not really. I mean, so, okay, if you think, what is reality? Okay, if you see something in reality, it's because light bounces off of something, say, the walls of the room that you're in, and that, goes into your eyes, and your eyes react in a certain way to that light, and it processes in a certain way in your brain, and then you see the wall in front of you. Well, if you're looking at a screen, okay, well, light's coming off the screen and going into your eyes and getting processed by your brain. If a computer in the same room as you is controlling what's on that screen, then same story. If a computer halfway around the world is controlling what's on that screen, again, same story. You're still having experience. You are still actually seeing something. Your eyes are actually seeing actual physical light that's caused by an actual physical thing. If you, paddle a canoe across a river. Well, there's a physical canoe coming into contact with physical, molecules of water. If you're in a really convincing VR simulation, there's not physical water necessarily, but what there is an actual physical computer that is simulating the water, right? It's keeping track of your actual physical movements, right? To give you input that will go into your actual physical brain that your brain will have to then interpret as, oh, it's just like I'm paddling down a river, right? So again, these sorts of virtual experiences, yes, they're virtual environments. They're not physical environments, but that doesn't mean they're not real. It doesn't mean that nothing happens, that there's not an actual matter of fact, right? So if you beat a certain video game, it's true that you beat that video game. Like there's a thing that actually happened in reality with electrons, with the hardware states of various machines, with the software states of various machines. That is all part of reality. It really does occur. It's not simply, a vapor or all imagination or something. Even imagination is real. You can't imagine something without an actual physical brain. And so if you'll forgive the digression a little bit, consider how much people actually value what they do and how they interact in created environments. Right, the people who make content on YouTube, or people who spend a lot of time in a particular video game, right? I mean, how much do we actually value those experiences? In some cases, quite a lot. The experiences actually happened. Virtual environments are environments that we can interact with each other in all the time. If we have a class period over Zoom, for example, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. It's not fake. It was an actual class period where actual people interacted with each other. It's just that they weren't in the same physical space. And so, yes, digital environments are not the same thing as physical environments, but that's just as trivial as saying that pickles are not the same thing as hamburgers. It doesn't mean anything more in the grand scheme of things. And you'll see a couple of book covers here. One of them, the book Fall by Neil Stephenson, and another Ready Player 2 by Ernest Cline. And these books came out within a fairly short period of time of each other. And you'll notice there are other television series that have started to really cotton on to this. And it seems to be a great preoccupation with speculative fiction to think about digital afterlives. Both of those things or the digital afterlife is very much what each of these novels is very much concerned with. And the idea is that if we could, if once we're done, physically living, if we could have experiences in a virtual environment and have those experiences continue long after our physical bodies are no more, wouldn't that be a good thing, right? Couldn't it be potentially valuable? Wouldn't it be something that we would actually want? And if you think about it, that's all these things are, is just Nozick's human experience machine, really only if they were designed really well, right? And so if we're thinking, well, gosh, if that might be something that we'd want for our futures anyway, why not for our presents? What would be the big deal? So again, a lot of people think of the experience machine argument as a kind of knockdown argument to hedonism. I'm not so sure, right? I think that there are lots of things that the hedonist can say here, and they still do have this plausible idea that, look, pleasure is pleasure, right? It doesn't really matter where it comes from. It's that's part of what makes life. It's really it's the biggest part of what makes life good. A much more serious problem with hedonism, with the idea that pleasure is the only component of the good life, or the life with the most pleasure in it is the best one, is that it runs into a really interesting idea, and this idea is expressed really excellently by Daniel Kahneman in a talk he gave called The Riddle of Experiences versus Memory in 2010. That talk is also linked in the recommended readings section of the course. But he starts off putting it this way. He says, there is a confusion between experience and memory. Basically, it's between being happy in your life and being happy about your life. And those are two very different concepts. There is an experiencing self who lives in the present, knows the present, is capable of reliving the past, but basically it has only the present. It's the experiencing self that the doctor approaches when the doctor asks, does it hurt now when I touch you here? And then there's the remembering self, And the remembering self is the one that keeps score, maintains the story of our life. And it's the one that the doctor approaches in asking the question, how have you been feeling lately? Or how was your trip to Albania? Or something like that. Those are two very different entities. I think this is a very astute observation, right? It's a very, very important distinction to make between being happy in our life or experiencing pleasure in our life and being happy about our lives. So let's take a further look at the trouble. Kahneman continues here. He says, now the experiencing self lives its life continuously. It has moments of experience one after the other. And you can ask, what happens to these moments? And the answer is really straightforward. They're lost forever. I mean, most of the memories of our life don't leave a trace. Most of them are completely ignored by the remembering self, and yet somehow you get the sense that they should count, that what happens during these moments of experience is our life. It's the finite resource that we're spending while we're on this earth, and how to spend it would seem to be relevant. But that is not the story that the remembering self keeps for us. So think about that for a minute, and think, sometimes people say, look, I'm defined by my experiences, my memories define who I am, but how many of your experiences do you actually remember? I mean, how much do you remember from, even very recently, like what did you eat for lunch last Tuesday, right? How much do you remember from your entire 8th year of life, right? Very likely it's only little snippets and bits and pieces, really only the kind of unusual things, right? The memorable things. And so it seems like even though we think that our experiences are our lives, it seems like when we evaluate how well our life has gone, most of that we completely ignore. We completely throw it away. It just doesn't stick around. And so if hedonism is correct, and the experience of happiness is what makes a life good, then we would expect our experiences to be more represented in how we evaluate our lives. But again, most of our experiences are not remembered at all. And the trouble continues. So Kahneman here presents a really useful thought experiment. He says, so I want you to think about a thought experiment. Imagine that for your next vacation, you know that at the end of the vacation, all your pictures will be destroyed, and you'll get an amnesic drug that you won't remember anything. Now, would you choose the same vacation? And if you would choose a different vacation, there is a conflict between your two selves, and you need to think about how to adjudicate that conflict. And it's actually not at all obvious, because if you think in terms of experiences, then you get one answer, and if you think in terms of memories, you might get another answer. Why do we pick the vacations we do is a problem that confronts us with a choice between the two selves. And again, if you think about vacations that you have either gone on or planned to go on or want to go on, a lot of those vacations are chosen on account of anticipated memories. You choose experiences that you will anticipate looking back fondly on, even if there's some things about them that are sort of unpleasant. So, for example, going to Disney World, right? You say, oh well, we'll have all these memories of having been at Disney World and seen the things and done the things that you do when you go to Disney World. But of course, the actual experience involves a lot of hot weather, whether it be Florida or California, depending on which Disney you go to, high prices, a lot of standing in lines, a lot of sort of jostling among strangers, and in real time, these are the sort of experiences that you have when you go. But the biggest reason to go to places like this is to be able to remember later that you were there, to sort of relive that memory, to be able to say that you saw it. And so if you chose, vacations just for what the moment-to-moment experience would be like, you might choose a very different kind of vacation. And so the idea is, are we choosing like a hedonist, that is choosing sort of moment-to-moment experiences, or are we choosing on some other metric that tends to ignore most of those experiences? And it seems like for the most part, what we do is we actually do the latter. We sort of, the remembering self seems to be in charge of our most sort of core evaluation of how our lives are going for us. And so this is a very interesting problem with hedonism, and it does sort of lead us very naturally into our next view. If we're evaluating things on the basis of sort of our memories, if we're trying to say, oh well, how good is our life based on the kind of story we can tell about it, well, we're starting to get into something like a desire satisfaction view. Right? So rather than hedonism, which says that the best life is the one with the most pleasure in it, the desire satisfaction family of views say that well-being consists in satisfying desires, right? But very importantly, it's not because it feels good to satisfy those desires, right? That would be hedonism. Rather, it's that there has been a desire that has been fulfilled. Right? Whether that desire feels good in any way is beside the point, right? What makes a life good is that the most desires are satisfied in it. Schaefer-Landau points out a lot of different versions of the view and how various different objections to the view have tended to force desire satisfaction theorists to modify their view a little bit. That's a very common thing with desire satisfaction views, is that the kind of counterexamples that people dream up tend to cause desire satisfaction theorists to modify their view a little bit to account for those objections. And so if you start off with a very basic view, this is view the view described as view A in the text, that desire satisfaction is necessary for well-being, right? That is that you have to have desire satisfied in order to have a good life. Schaefer-Landau points out several counterexamples that all work perfectly well, and of course, if you think about it, you could doubtless think of many more. So one of these would be pleasant surprises. Okay, so these are the sort of good things that happen to you, things that happen to you that you really enjoy, even though you didn't desire them, right? It wasn't something that you wanted to happen. It was just something that happens, and you're like, oh, well, that was great, right? Maybe you didn't want that certain thing to happen. Maybe you sort of didn't want a particular event, but all of a sudden it happens, and you're like, oh, that was actually really good, right? So that's what we call a pleasant surprise. And if the desire satisfaction view is correct, right, that the best life is the one that has the most desire satisfied, well, pleasant surprises seem to run counter to that. There's something that you don't actually desire, but you do think makes your life better. Small children, for example, for the most part, their lives would go better for them if they didn't get most of what they wanted, right? In fact, if you remember being a fairly small child, you'll remember wanting lots of things that you can't have, or that your parents tell you, no, you can't have that, or no, you don't really want that, or etc. Right? And your parents are right in almost every case. No matter how many of these things, these are things that you might want them, but it doesn't mean that getting them would actually do you any good. In fact, in some cases, getting all of the things you want would be fairly bad for you. Certainly, we don't. We raise our children that way, and so we do raise our children in a way that's contrary to this desire satisfaction idea. Also, suicide prevention. Sometimes, in various points in people's lives, they believe that they want to be dead. They believe that they don't want to continue living. And for the most part, when people intervene, right, when they're prevented from killing themselves, they eventually will say, "Oh, goodness, I'm sure glad I didn't." But that's another case where it's actually better for somebody in most cases to not get what they want, right? So it does seem like desire satisfaction is not really necessary for well-being, and so you could consider another view. Perhaps desire satisfaction is sufficient for well-being. That is, that whenever your desires are satisfied, that does actually make your life go better for you, right? Even if some things can make your life better, even if you didn't desire them. Okay, so this is an interesting view, but again, there's some pretty basic counterexamples, right? And so you might have all kinds of different desires based on sort of false beliefs. And I've thrown in a selection of false advertising, so like for example, 5-hour energy doesn't really do anything for you other than a brief bit of sugar, and in fact a sugar rush is mostly a psychological thing. It doesn't really occur anyway. So it's just it's marketing fluff. It doesn't really do much of anything. And of course, the advertised hamburger at Burger King, or any other restaurant, especially fast food restaurants, versus the actual thing that you get is very, very different. Hydroxycut, pretty much any diet pill or diet plan, it's almost all very, just false advertising. So the idea is that you might desire to have certain of these things, even if these things don't actually make your life any better, right? And once you get these things, maybe you're just not even really going to be satisfied. Your life isn't going to go any better for you if you get these things that you think you want. Okay, and so we call these things desires based on false beliefs, because the idea is these are things that you think you want. These are things that you think will be good for you, but once you get them, they don't actually make your life any better for you. And it seems like, again, you can come up with hundreds of examples of these things, and I'll leave that to your imagination. But all of these things demonstrate that when a desire is satisfied, it doesn't always make you any better off. And so one of the things you might do is you might modify that. You might say, okay, well, how about satisfaction of informed desires is sufficient for well-being? That is, whenever one of your desires that isn't based on some kind of false belief is satisfied, then your life goes better for you. Well, this is a little bit better. But again, there are plenty of pretty easy counterexamples. So one might include desires that do not affect your interests. One of Schaefer-Landa's examples is having a desire that there be an even number of planets in the solar system. So, after they kicked Pluto out, you finally satisfied that desire. But of course, does that make your life go any better if there are 8 planets instead of 9? It's hard to see how it would. There are also plenty of other regarding desires, right? So for example, I want the teams that I cheer for to win the championship. But if they do, it's hard to see how my life actually got any better. I might enjoy the experience of watching those things happen, but in terms of, if I'm unhealthy, then, I'm before the Braves win the World Series, then I'm, still unhealthy after they win the World Series. If I am friendless before the Braves win the World Series, I'm very likely friendless after they win the World Series. If I'm, ignorant before the Jayhawks win the men's basketball title, then I'm ignorant afterward too. So again, it's hard to see how if my health, friendships, and intellectual state don't get any better, then in what sense am I better off for any of these things that I desired? Right. So these are what we call other regarding desires. Right. These are things you want for other people. Right. Again, Schaefer-Landa gives a really great example. He remembers reading about some whale that ended up that was beached and in trouble, and he said, "Oh, I really sure hope that they get that whale back into the ocean and it survives." And it turns out they did, right? But it's hard to see how his life is any better for that, right? And so yes, he had a desire if it's satisfied, but again, does that make your life really any better? So it seems like we have to modify the view again. And instead we'll modify it into saying, okay, how about satisfaction of all of your informed self-regarding desires is sufficient for well-being? So anytime you have a desire about yourself, right, about something for you, like I want to learn Spanish or something like that, and then when you learn Spanish, then that makes your life go better for you because it fulfills a self-regarding desire. Also, it's an informed self-regarding desire. So again, it's not based on any false beliefs or anything like that. Okay, that sounds better. But of course, the counterexample here are various cases of disappointment, where you might have good reason to believe that you would like a certain thing, and it is a self-regarding desire, but you just might not like it when you get it, right? Or it might not make your life go any better. And again, you can find many examples of these. Schaefer-Landa lists a couple, including one from the tennis player John McEnroe's autobiography. But here I've listed a quote from Harrison Ford, actor's been in some of my favorite stuff from when I was growing up. And he says, there's nothing good about being famous. You always think if I'm successful, then I'll have opportunities. You never figure the cost of fame will be a total loss of privacy. That's incalculable. What a burden that is for anybody. It was unanticipated, and I've never enjoyed it. You can get the table you want in a restaurant. It gets you doctor's appointments, but what's that worth? Nothing. Right. So there's a lot of people who think that they'd love to be sort of, rich and famous, especially famous. And yet at least some famous people, when they get there, think, well, this sucks. And Harrison Ford seems to be certainly one of those, or at least it seems to be that what he's expressing here. So again, it seems like there can be fully informed self-regarding desires that even when fulfilled, don't actually seem to make your life go any better for you. So we can modify the view again. We can add another qualifier. We can say, okay, fine. How about it's the satisfaction of informed, self-regarding desires that bring pleasure? That's what ends up making your life good for you. And every time that happens, your life gets better for you. Right? Well, in this case, we start to run the risk of going all the way back to hedonism, because it seems like in this case, isn't it the pleasure that's valuable, not the desire satisfaction itself? Right. And again, there are a set of counterexamples here. So one of those is unaware desire satisfaction. That is, if you desired that, so imagine somebody you didn't get along with in third grade, and you at some point wish, oh, I really wish that person gets a taste of their own medicine, right? Like maybe they're very rude, and you wish somebody'd be rude to them at some point, and maybe it happens 15 years down the road when you're in a different town, they're in a different town, you're not connected in any way, and it happens. Somebody's really rude to that person. They say, oh, that felt terrible. Man, I feel bad about some of the things that I've done to other people in my life, or something like that. I mean, just like spin your own scenario, but like you'll never find out about it. And so you had your desire satisfied in this case, and it's an informed desire, right? I mean, it's a self-regarding desire, right? You want, a certain thing, right? And I don't know, maybe that's the idea is that, yeah, if you're just unaware, right, of these sorts of things, then it seems hard to say how those things could really improve well-being. I guess in these cases, those cases of unaware desire satisfaction, you really can focus on that last bit, that is desires that bring pleasure, because it does seem that if you're totally unaware that your desire is satisfied, it seems like it would be hard for pleasure to come out of it. But you could think of examples where pleasure comes out of it accidentally or something like that. I don't know. Some of the better counterexamples include things like impoverished desires, right? So if you imagine somebody who grows up in such, say, horribly abusive circumstances, right? Where, they sort of think, oh gosh, my only desire, I just want to have an avocado once a month, or I just want to be able to leave a closet for, just a day or so here and there, a couple days a year or something like that. I mean, so again, imagine somebody's just, brought up in really horrible circumstances, and they have just such meager desires, right? Well, it seems like it could be very easy to fulfill those desires, but does that mean that person has a good life? Right, that all of their desires get fulfilled, meager as they are? So in that case, it seems like the best life would be the one with the lowest expectations, and that doesn't seem right. Also, there's a whole family of what we call oddball desires. John Rawls has a famous one where, he says, imagine that somebody just wants to count the blades of grass in their yard. That's all they really want. For whatever reason, they just have this desire, right? I just want to know how many blades of grass are on my lawn. And so if they find out, right, this is like their sort of only desire, it seems like they would have led a great life. And yet something seems wrong with that. It seems like, well, it seems like a waste of time. Even if that's what they want to do, it's hard to call that a great life. If somebody wants to just, again, Schaeffer has a couple of funny examples. He says, if I just want to say the word putty until I die, right? If that's what I want, then it seems like, it does seem bizarre to say that if you end up accomplishing that, end up satisfying that desire, if you end up enjoying just saying putty until you die, then you have led the best life. And again, it seems, the trouble is that that desires should be evaluated in and of themselves. And so the biggest problem that, look, some people really do like desire theory, right? Some people really do subscribe to it, and that's great. Those who do not tend to all do it for some part of the same reason. They think of it something like this. They say that the idea that desire satisfaction is a good-making property is somewhat odd, right? As Aristotle says, desire is consequent on opinion rather than opinion on desire. In other words, we desire things such as writing a great novel, not because we think those things are independently good. We do not think they are good because they will satisfy our desires for them. So in other words, basically the reason you want to write a great book is because you think that's a good thing to do, right? You don't think it's good just because you desire it, right? You desire it because it's good. You think that there's something about, there's something about grass counting that somebody shouldn't desire. That if they do, that's a kind of mistake, right? There's nothing actually good about counting grass or saying putty until you die. And so this is a sort of, the famous sage George Carlin put it this way. He said, if you ever hear people complain, my needs aren't being met, his advice is drop some of your needs. Right? He says that the sort of desires you have ought to track a good life, right? You ought to desire that which will make your life better. It's not that something makes your life better just because you desire it. Right? That tends to be the reason that people who do reject the desire theory reject it. So this brings us at long last to the final family of views. This one's a lot briefer, and actually Schaefer-Landau completely leaves it out. Well, not completely. There's just a very brief mention of it, but it doesn't get its own chapter or really even its own section. It's very bizarre. But again, it is one of the major families of views. And so on this view, well-being consists of more than just pleasure or desire satisfaction. And again, there are many objective list views that are out there. There's lots of different things, and it just depends on what's on the list. Lots of objective list views have at least some similarities. Most objective lists include pleasure, right? Because pleasure is good. It's among the things that make a life go well for you. It's just that objective list theorists think pleasure's not the only thing that makes your life go good for you. Yeah, the more pleasure, the better, but there's some other things you need too. So in addition to pleasure, some of the things that people will point to are things like friendship, knowledge, achievements of various kinds, right? Virtue, right? So having a certain kind of character, right? And also autonomy, right? Being able to sort of choose for oneself. And so all of these things may not come with great pleasure. Okay. Very often having more knowledge doesn't necessarily make you enjoy any particular thing more. It doesn't feel good to know more necessarily. But if you look at two different lives, one in which somebody knew a great deal and one in which somebody did not know a great deal, you might say that the life of knowledge was greater, right? All other things being equal. A life with great achievements in it seems to be better than one without one. Again, all other things being equal. A life with good friendships in it seems better than the one with less friendships. And even if we're not going to reduce those things to something like pleasures. And so that's the point of the objective list view, is to say, yes, pleasure is important, but it's only one important thing. There are these other things that are important, not really for the pleasure they bring, but they're important in and of themselves. Right? In other words, these are all things that are intrinsically valuable. And there's a lot of disagreement about what to put on that list. A couple of prominent versions of objective list views are detailed by Roger Crisp, and I'll just sort of read that out here. He says, what is the good maker according to objective list theorists? Well, this depends on the theory. One, influenced by Aristotle and recently developed by Thomas Herke, is called perfectionism, according to which what makes things constituents of well-being is their perfecting of human nature. On the history of modern perfectionism, see David Brink, 2019. If it is part of a human nature to acquire knowledge, for example, then a perfectionist should claim that knowledge is a constituent of well-being. So basically this says that we have to consider what kinds of beings we are, the kinds of needs that we have, the kinds of things that development of which tends to make our lives better for us, and those are all the various different things that go on the objective list. So that's a perfectionism. That's Herke's view, and I actually think I agree with Crisp. I think Brink's discussion is really excellent. Like all of our other theories, objectivist views have generated some objections. And again, these are quotes from Roger Crespi. He has this nice little section that details some of the issues with objectivist views. And so the objection goes this way. One common objection to objectivist theories is that they are elitist, since they appear to be claiming that certain things are good for people, even if those people will not enjoy them and do not even want them. Right? Remember, hedonism is the view that the more pleasure in life, the better, right? So an objectivist view has to say, well, look, some things can be good for you, even if you don't enjoy them. Right? And well, maybe that's right, maybe it isn't. Remember, the desire satisfaction view said the only thing that makes something good is that it's a desire that gets satisfied. Somebody wants it, right? Whereas, again, the objectivist theorist says, look, some things can be good for you, even if you don't want them, right? Again, maybe that's true, and maybe it isn't. It sounds plausible, at least to some degree. And so the objectivist theorists' reply to this, right, says that a strategy here might be to adopt a kind of hybrid account, according to which certain goods do benefit people independently of pleasure and desire satisfaction, but only when they do in fact bring pleasure and or satisfy desires. Another reply is to simply bite the bullet and point out that a theory could be both elitist and true. Right? It may be elitist to say that, some things might be good for people, whether those people want those things or whether those things bring those people pleasure or not. That doesn't necessarily mean the view is wrong. And so, just to summarize, right, the objectivist views in general, those views are at least as plausible as hedonism. Remember, hedonism is also an objective view. It just says whatever causes pleasure, pleasure being a real, actual thing. Basically, hedonism is an objectivist view that has only one thing on the list, and that is pleasure. And so there's at least that much that hedonists and objectivist views have in common. But the difficulty of the objectivist view is identifying, right, the good-making feature of each thing on the list, saying not only what's on the list, but why does that thing get to go on the list, right? And how do you limit the list, etc. And so those are some difficulties that objectivist views do tend to run into. Although there's a lot about an objectivist view that does actually make sense, much like there's a lot about hedonism that makes sense, and there's a lot about desire satisfaction views that do make sense, even though all of these views do have their problems. So there it is. That's the most basic overview of theories of well-being that can be done all at one go. And I just wanted to end by pointing out the importance for moral theories, and again, keeping the difference here. There is a difference between a theory of well-being and a theory of morality. A theory of well-being is a theory about what actually makes a person's life go well for them, right? What makes a life worth living? What makes a life a good life? A moral theory is a theory about what the right thing to do is, or perhaps what the right character to have is, right? The right way to be. Those are different questions, but they are next door to each other, right? And so our answers to some of these questions about what makes a life a good one will affect what kinds of things are the right things to do. There is usually some connection between theories of morality and theories of well-being. And in some cases, we'll notice that theories of well-being will end up being components of some theories of morality. Very specifically, in the next unit, we'll talk about how the theory of hedonism is part of a moral theory known as utilitarianism.